great. All right, let's see. So glad to be here. Incredible conference. Thanks, Nick and Hannah, for organizing and doing it so well, and such a warm welcome. So the title of my talk is The Wrong Kind of Desire, the Queer Potential of Envy in Kathy Acker's Anti-Identitarian Project. So I have a PowerPoint which I will only use for citations, longer citations. There will be no extra information. So also feel free to not look at the screen while listening. So as queers, our genders and text constantly fail to conform to social norms. Not only a failure to conform to heteronormativity, but queerness often also deviates from homonormativity. Desires, whether they are queer or straight, are always unstable. They never completely align with what one considers as their identity. Desires can be pleasurable, but unwanted desires can be irritating too, as is the case with jealousy and envy. Desiring the wrong thing can feel like a heavy moral conflict, as the existence of queer identities is a battle in itself. Can heteronormative desires exist within queerness? Is there such a thing as a wrong queer desire? Envy is a classic example of an unwanted desire. Its connection to gender famously theorized by Freud as penis envy, and later by Valerie Solanas in Scum Manifesto as pussy envy. I'm interested in the ways desire and identification work together when they are not restricted by identity, in particular by gender identity, as in Kathy Acker's work. How does desire function when identity is unstable? Or the other way around, how does desire destabilize identity in the process of desiring? Plus, how do these unwanted or negative desires function in this framework? So despite its negativity, envy can be constitutive of a queer subject without reducing queer identity to pure negativity. As some strands of queer theory have formulated it, queer identity as an anti-position, queer inquiry as ultimately relying on anti-normativity. Of course, envy implies lack, but it also plays a crucial role in subject formation, if we accept that identity is based on conflicting desires. The affect theorist Diane Guy writes in her book Ugly Feelings how envy is generally designated as a passive condition of the subject, rendering it a reflection of deficient selfhood, and thus stripping it of its polemicism. End of quotes. Envy is a gesture of disidentification, a desire that points towards a lack, what you don't have but want. It's also a desire that relies on idealization, unable to enter or take possession of the object. Kaya Silverman, however, maintains that the process of idealization is essential to how gender comes into being. She writes that, quote, "Those deconstructing gender have made a serious strategic mistake. We have consistently argued against idealization, that psychic activity at the heart of love, rather than imagining the new uses to which it might be put. We have overlooked a crucial component within the identificatory process." End of quote. Discourses on queerness often rely on positive identifications, affirming identity, a celebration of queer pride. Still, it is obvious that queer identifications are not or cannot be always positive, as in reaffirming of an already existing identity. Instead, identity comes into being through positive as well as negative desires, the ugly feelings. And there is no preceding identity that your desire will confirm. More recently, Andrea Long Chu argued in various essays in her book Females that transgender desires, and by extension desires in general, never express an innate truth of an identity, but that any identity only comes into being through desire, more specifically the desires of others. And that the problem with desire is that we rarely want the things we should. Besides the infamous penis envy, Andrea Long Chu's reading of Valerie Solanas of Females as a case of pussy envy provides more material to think about envy and its relation to queer subjects. Chu theorizes that her own transness emerged from a desire to be like women, not necessarily the expression of some sort of repressed female identity. as the mainstream discourse around transgender identifications often describes it. Wanting to be like someone is to let others define your desires for you, to let others do the desiring for you. So in her book, Females, Chu argues that in fact everyone is female, on an ontological level at least, because she defines universalism as being female as any psychic operation in which the self is sacrificed to make room for the desires of another. These desires may be real or imagined, concentrated or diffuse, a boyfriend's sexual needs, a set of cultural expectations, a literal pregnancy. But in all cases, the self is hollowed out, made into an incubator of an alien force. To be female is to let someone else do your desiring for you at your own expense. End of quote. I will not get into the viability of Chu's argument here, but I will take her attention for fantasy and desire as external, to think about envy and how desire functions in the work of the American author, Kathy Acker. So I will give a brief background of Kathy Acker's work so I can talk about how her experimental texts illustrate the complicated dynamic between identity, gender, and sexuality. So Acker consistently appropriates voices and identities by copying and twisting them, and envy plays a role in that appropriation. Starting with her recurring character, Janie, who is envious of men because of their power, which for Janie is that they have a language at their disposal, but she, as a young girl, does not have her own language or literary history. So one of Acker's earliest works is titled Politics. It's from 1972, and it's an erotic prose poem in which she writes about the experience of doing sex work on 42nd Street in New York City. In this text, she merges her own fantasies and dreams with the scripts of the sex show and conversations between strippers she overheard. These different bits and pieces of text come together in one singular first-person narrator, not in a third person or objective narrator, because, as Acker stated in an interview, she did not want to be a sociologist. With Politics, she applied for the first time her fake I, as she called the narrator of her false autobiography, a writing strategy that would become central to all of her subsequent work. So Kathy Acker's engagement with the politics of the first-person narrator in literature derived from her rebellion against her literary forefathers, the Black Mountain poets, and their poetics of authenticity. They believed that every writer has a unique voice, and that it is the task of the author to give expression to that voice. Acker found this very confusing because she didn't know what her own voice was, if she had one, where she could find it. And so she started to write in different voices in a schizophrenic manner. But Acker's voices are not simply fictions. She appropriated voices of writers and characters from canonical works like Charles Dickens, Don Quixote, or Arthur Rimbaud, and merged them with personal fantasies and fictionalized her own autobiographical events, which then often feature a character named Kathy. In an interview, she explained this writing strategy, which also confused herself. Quote, I was splitting the I into false and true I's, and I just wanted to see if this false I was more or less real than the true I. What are the reality levers between false and true and how it worked? And of course, there is no difference. By the end of the tarantula, when I do the Desaad business, I can't tell what's true or false, except for actual dates. If I say I was born in 1748, I know that's false. End of quote. So for Acker, there's no essential difference between the fictional I and the real I, as they are both narrated selves. Acker's project can be formulated as an attempt to decentralize identity, and her fake autobiography is not a search for herself or oneself. Rather, it is an attempt to decentralize as well as pluralize the self. In Kathy Acker's work, there is no I and no other. There are only I's to appropriate. Acker wrote that to see is to be an I, E-Y-E, and not an I. Gender identity then changes as often as her narrators do. I think that Acker's writing practice is an anti-identitarian project in two ways. First, her destabilizing of a coherent or rational sense of self, And secondly, as a consequence, identities come into being without origin. A project which consistently undermines the idea of a stable self in the text, as it is impossible to pin down the identity of the narrator or to make sense of the narrational voice. In one novel, for example, the narrator is simultaneously Arthur Rimbaud and Kathy Acker. And in her novel Great Expectations, which starts with the literal first paragraph of Charles Dickens' famous novel, there are multiple narrators emerging in a compilation of fragmented narratives in collage style. In Acker's work, the empty vessel of the literary I, the first person singular, is plural, because she uses and abuses the speaking position of the I to inhabit different identities and positions from literature, and also from the multiple selves she was in her own life. Acker also explores the use of what she calls the languages of the body, a non-authoritarian use of language that is based on sensuality rather than rationality. She sought a kind of primary language, a language that can express subjectivity as directly as possible, often resulting in stream of consciousness narratives and pornography, in which she also notes reflections on the difficulty to express the body and its experience in language. In an essay from the 90s, Acker posed the question whether sensuality is less valuable than rational thought. In her text, rationalism is considered to be at the core of patriarchy, and the explicit expression of sexual desire might function as a way to undermine rational and logical ways of thinking. Acker also called her work stupid in the most simple sense, in that it refuses to hierarchize intelligence over other ways of knowing and thinking. One form of desire that Acker plays with is envy, which in Acker's work does not function as an identity marker, but rather as an identity shifter. Envy gestures towards the other, an identification as much as disidentification. As the writer Joanna Walsh puts it in an essay on her own envious relationship to Acker's work, envy is a border war. This is a quote. The delineation of borders between self and other, once drawn, provokes a desire to cross, enabling a helpless assertion of subjectivity, an interdependent I, we. In Acker's work, there is no I and no other. All produce a going in between, in which I is no longer in a scarcity economy. End of quote. I would like to stay with this thought of the I no longer being in scarcity economy to think about envy. Because if desire is ultimately aspirational, it always already hints at its potential failure. Perhaps not even potential, but inherent failure. Both the eventual goal of the desire, as well as the process of desiring itself, are prone to failure. It can be disappointing, for example, because the desire does not suit your political convictions, or because the desire is stupid in a different way. Bad desires are what Sian Nagai has called ugly feelings, such as envy, jealousy, but are also what Heather Love calls politically unpromising affects. Failure, disidentification, depression, masochism, radical passivity, shyness, cruel optimism, melancholy. Simply put, the problem with our desires is that we rarely want the things we should. But instead of moralizing desire or rejecting these negative desires, we can consider them as much constitutive of identity, of queer identity, as those desires which might be labeled as positive in queer thought. In her essay on liking women, Andrea Langchu again writes that desire is by nature childlike and chary of government. The day we begin to qualify it by the righteousness of its political content is the day we begin to prescribe some desires and prohibit others. That way lies moralism only. Just try to imagine life as a feminist anemone, the tendrils of your desire withdrawing in an instant from patriarchy's every touch. There would be nothing left, nothing to watch on TV. End of quotes. For Chu, the problem with desire is a problem with the idea of gender identity as expressive of an internal truth. For her, there is no difference between wanting to be like women and wanting to be a woman. Being trans, then, is not a matter of who one is, but of what one wants. So desire structures as well as destabilizes identity. And that desire always leads to failure. So desire is endlessly, dissatisfying. As Drew puts it, you don't want something because wanting it will lead to getting it. You want it because you want it. This is the zero order disappointment that structures all desire and makes it possible. After all, if you could only want the things you were guaranteed to get, you would never be able to want anything at all. End of quote. Feminist and queer theory tends to rely on positive identifications, reaffirming specific queer identities rather than defining them in negative terms, even though queer identities come into being through those ugly feelings as well. Perhaps even more crucial is not that they are part of queer identity, but that scrutinizing them makes it possible to move away from this queer moralism. In the end, identity does not precede desire. There's no self that the desires will confirm. So I want to propose that Kathy Acker's formalism of desire and her anti-identitarian tendencies create a textual practice in which identity constantly contradicts itself, and in which negative or so-called bad desires also can have a place in her text, as her text can always take the instability of the self and of desire as its subject. So in conclusion, how can envy work as a queer affect? When the I is no longer in a scarcity economy, envy doesn't necessarily have to be limiting. Envy is desire on the move, testing the grounds for what is possible to want and to be, which in Acker, to want something is to want everything. In her text, not only gender identity, but also sexual identity is never fixed. And envy of men, of lesbians, anything that Acker's character Kathy or Janie cannot access directly, functions as a mechanism which allows for shifting expressions of identity and sexual desires. Lauren Berland writes about how identity obscures the complexity of desire. Quote, identity is a mirage of the ego that gives you an I and a name to protect you from being overwhelmed by the stimuli you encounter, and or a mirage of the social order, which teaches you to renounce your desires, excess, and ambivalence, so that you can be intelligible under the discipline of the norms that make hierarchies of social values seem natural by rooting them in the pseudo-natural structure of heterosexual, sexualized sexual difference. Perhaps desire in Acker's work is always in excess. To want something is to want everything. This impossible position illustrates the nature of desire itself. Moreover, Kathy Acker's appropriation of identities in text leads to a formalism of desire that refuses authenticity. Your desires are never really yours. And in her abuse of the authority of canonical authors, the used texts come to serve a new purpose, a completely narcissistic purpose perhaps, but her play with identity refuses any kind of final meaning, as she recycles and rethinks the encoded meanings of the text. According to Lee Edelman, queer is not in an oppositional relation to the social order. Rather, queer is the structural negativity that makes sociality and subjectivity possible. This paper that tries to think about subjectivity, queerness, and desire is an attempt to take this structural negativity into account. Jealousy, envy, and idealization are powerful affective mechanisms that cause a temporary destabilization of the I who is and who desires. In the sensational world of Kathy Acker's text, then, we can find a queer textual practice in which gender identity has no origin and ambiguous, conflicting desires guide the narrational I through the text, emptying out the self along the way. All right, I'll stop here. I would love any comments or questions later.